All right, so deep inside the stem of a plant are tubes that transport water. They are the xylem. Okay, a pea plant is growing up a fence using vines that are stimulated by touch. This is called thigmotropism. Okay, a bristlecone pine is the oldest tree in the world at 5,000 years. It can get this old because it always makes new cells using cytokinins. All right. Okay, the blank layer of the leaf is responsible for photosynthesis. Palisade. All right. The blank is a layer of wax secreted by a plant to prevent water loss. Cuticle. Bananas ripen quickly because they produce lots of what? What? Ethylene. What does the phloem transport? Sugar. I'd even just accept sugar. Sugary saps is great too. Okay. Transpiration and blank create the force that pulls water up a plant. Osmosis. Okay, give them a mark out of 8. Let them see it. Put it in the box. And thanks for everyone having their plant transport labs done. I don't have to chase anyone, yell at anyone, or, yeah, incarcerate you to get it done or anything. Okay. So we're going to be going over just some of the AP only stuff today. In fact, that's what we're going over today and tomorrow as I'm finishing up all of the AP only stuff. It's going to be me talking really, really fast, okay, and you highlighting stuff in your notes and keeping up, okay? This stuff will not be on Thursday's unit exam, okay? I test you only on the regular Science 10 stuff, but this stuff is important because it will be background stuff if you're taking Bio 20 AP. This stuff is super important for you to know. All right? So it's important that way. It is not on the test on Thursday. It should be if you printed off the AP notes package. If you just printed off the regular Science 10 notes package, you will not have it. Okay? But it should be in the AP one. All right. So what we need to distinguish between here, guys, okay, we're looking at reproduction and variation and how the different types of reproductive methods can produce variation. And what we mean by variation is differences between individuals. All right, obviously within our classroom there's lots of variation, okay, between each one of us, even though we sort of all have the same general characteristics, okay? 2 arms, 2 legs, etc. Right? But there are individual variations. Hair color, blood type, okay? Skin pigmentation, all of that kind of stuff is all based on your genetic code, okay? And how you get your genes and the arrangement that they are in, okay, comes from the joining of gametes, okay, during reproduction. Everybody with me there? At least it does for us, okay? If you're a single-celled organism, you just split in half, all right? Now, is there going to be as much variation if all you do is split in half? No, essentially you just copy your DNA over, okay? And every organism you ever produce by splitting in half is exactly the same as you are. All right? Now, there are little its and bits of variations, there are mutations that can happen, and there are some organisms, single-celled, that reproduce by what we call binary fission, okay, splitting in half, that can actually conjugate with each other and exchange genetic information, which would produce variation when they then split in half, because now they have different genetic codes, okay? The Paramecium is an example of that. Right? We looked at them under the microscope. They actually have a micronucleus and a macronucleus. They produce the micronucleus when they're ready to conjugate with another paramecium. And when they do, they exchange micronuclei. Okay? And then the micronucleus goes and joins with the macronucleus, and the DNA kind of gets written together, and now it's slightly genetically different. Right? And so its offspring would be genetically different. Variation is important. Okay? Why? Well, it doesn't so much help each organism, but it helps the species be better able to adapt to their environment. Because if every individual in your species is exactly the same, and something comes along that can kill one of you, it'll kill all of you. Right? If there's variation, however, right, then the survivability of the species, not necessarily the individual, is more likely. Right? You may have one individual whose genetic code makes them able to survive whatever changes have come along, and that individual reproduces, and all of its offspring possess those genes, etc. Okay, and the species moves on. All right. But if all your individuals are very much alike, or they are identical, then you could have trouble. Right? This is one of the big concerns in agriculture right now. Okay, a lot of the crop strains that we plant are genetic hybrids. Okay, they've been genetically modified to produce more food, grow in certain conditions, etc. But in that genetic modification, sometimes we've lost things that maybe the native or original plants had, okay, that now have been lost through the modification. Things like that can be resistance to certain types of fungus, okay, or things like that that could affect the plants. And people are concerned that if we're growing what's called a monoculture, all of them being exactly the same, that if something came along, we could lose an entire season's worth of crops because they would not be resistant to something. Okay, everyone kind of follow me there? So variation is important in that regard. All right, so we're going to distinguish between sexual and asexual reproduction. Okay, we're going to look at the examples of each type. Okay, understand how variation is produced in each type, and look at the benefits and drawbacks of each type in terms of adaptation to the environment and the production of variation. All right, so strictly speaking, in terms of binary fission, like begets like, which means you produce more of what you are. Okay. That only applies to organisms that reproduce asexually. So in asexual reproduction, a single individual is the sole parent and passes copies of all its genes onto its offspring. Okay, so a single-celled organism can reproduce asexually by mitosis. That's a technical term for cell division. Okay, that's a term you'll definitely need to know in Bio 20. Okay, in which DNA is copied and then put in each of the daughter cells. That's what they're called. It's not sexist. That's just what they're called. They're always daughter cells. Okay. The offspring are exact copies of the parent. Everybody with me there? Yes? Okay. Now, with simple, kind of either simple eukaryotic single-celled organisms or prokaryotic organisms, this is the only method of reproduction, okay, is binary fission. Variation is only produced through mutation. All right, so if something comes along and alters the DNA, that individual's DNA is different, and all of its offspring will be different. If you recall, a few weeks ago I told you this is one of the first things you'll do if you take university genetics. Okay, you will take some E. coli bacteria and grow them on a petri dish. Okay, and then you will irradiate them with an ultraviolet light for 30 seconds or whatever. Okay, well, that'll kill off a lot of them, but it'll mutate a lot of them as well. Okay, and what you do then is you place the new modified bacteria on another petri dish, okay, and this petri dish contains penicillin, and you'll find that penicillin usually kills E. coli bacteria, but you will find that a few organisms survive, okay, because the irradiation by ultraviolet light has mutated them and made them penicillin resistant. Okay, that single individual that became penicillin resistant reproduced, and now all of the ones on that dish are penicillin resistant, because they are exact copies of that individual. The ones that didn't become penicillin resistant died as soon as you put them on the dish. Everyone with me there? Okay, so we changed the environment, and some individuals were able to survive, some were not. Most were not. Okay. All right. Asexual reproduction can also happen in multicellular organisms, oddly enough. Okay, it's rare, but it can happen. Okay, the hydra is a prime example of this. Okay, the hydra can reproduce by what we call budding. Okay, and essentially what that is it makes a growth off the side of it that becomes another hydra, and then it kind of falls off and attaches somewhere nearby and begins its life cycle. All right, obviously that's good in that you don't need another hydra to reproduce, but is there any variation here? No, these are exact copies of each other. So while, yes, it produces more individuals, it doesn't produce more variation. Okay, so the cells of the bud were derived by mitotic cell division. That means just splitting in half. Okay, so they are genetically identical to the parent. Okay, very rarely genetic differences caused by changes in the DNA called mutations can cause small differences. Okay, so mutations are small changes in the DNA. Probably important to remember that too. Okay, potatoes. Potatoes reproduce by asexual reproduction as well. That's why you can cut one in half, throw it in the ground, and grow a new plant. Okay, you've taken a piece of one plant and grown another plant from it. Is it genetically identical? It has to be. Okay, the only source of DNA was the cells from the original potato plant. Right, and so yes, we can get potatoes that way, but we don't get any variation. All right, so if you only harvested one potato plant for seeds, okay, for seed potatoes the next year, all you're going to get are exact genetic copies of what you grew the year before, which, if it grew really, really well, is probably not a bad thing, because you know that all the potatoes you put in the ground worked last year. But what if this year you get some sort of bug, okay, and none of the potatoes are resistant to it and they all die? Would it have been better to have taken potatoes from a few plants then? Possibly, okay, as long as one of them had a resistance to the bug. Okay, things like that. So that's something to consider. All right, that's what the little eyes are here. We talked about that, right? You get these little eyes, okay? They can become leaves and things like that, but any plant that grows from that is genetically identical to the parent plant. Okay, we call that vegetative propagation. And you can do that with lots of plants. Okay, prime example, all these little plants, these big plants with the big leaves over here, they're all derived from one plant. Every time it gets too tall, I cut it off and stick it back in the ground. Okay, the part I stick in the ground grows, the part I cut off grows, okay, and I've got a whole bunch of genetically identical pieces of that plant. In fact, both of those plants came from a plant that my mother has. She gave it to me when I got my first house. She said, you need a plant in your house. So she cut a piece off of that plant, stuck it in the ground, and grew it for me. So these plants are genetically identical to the plant in my mother's house. Okay, I don't know where she got it from, but she got it the same way. Okay, and so we're all just growing clones of somebody's plant from however long ago. All right, we're not getting a lot of variation, but we're getting a lot of individuals. Okay, vegetative propagation can do that. There are lots of plants capable of doing that. You see it oftentimes after a flood or after a hurricane when trees have been broken off. Okay, if there's a lot of moisture and stuff in the ground, a broken off plant can actually grow roots from the point where it's broken off. Okay, and it will begin to grow again, kind of replanting itself. The original plant may also be able to grow from where it was broken off, and now you would have two copies of the individual. Everyone follow me there? Okay. You sometimes see this when a plant gets, like, let's say, cut down, and it'll start growing kind of little branches from down below again. Okay, all it's doing is just continuing to try and survive. All right, but those are genetically identical to the plant that was cut down. Okay, starfish. Starfish can do this too. Okay, for a long time, fishermen, they would get ticked off when starfish would get caught in their nets, because starfish have very rough skin and they kind of twist around and they would get all knotted up in the nets, and of course that would be annoying because you have to cut the nets and then mend the nets and whatever. Anyway, they didn't like it, so what they did is when they finally got them out, they'd rip them in half and throw them in the water, effectively doubling their problem. Okay, because what will happen is every piece of the starfish that contains a part of the central ring, okay, so this is just one arm of the starfish. You can see that it is growing new arms, all right, because it contains some part of the central disc of the starfish, and if it does, it can regrow all the arms it's missing. So if you tear a starfish in half, all you've done is made two starfish. Or if you've ripped every arm off and got just a little piece of the central disc, you'll have 5 new starfish to take its place. Okay, worms, same thing. If you cut an earthworm, you can cut it in a whole bunch of pieces, and every piece except the tip of the tail will grow into a new worm. All right? They're simple enough that they can regenerate, okay, some of their lost limbs. But, of course, where do they get the information from? The same cells. So even if you cut a worm into 5 pieces, all you've made is 5 clones of that worm. All right? Doesn't work. As you get more complex, it doesn't work. Don't think you can cut your arm off and grow a new you and that arm will just regenerate. It's not going to happen. Okay? Don't try that at home. All right? But for simple organisms, it does work. Okay? And so they can regenerate in that way. All right. So the thing to remember, though, is any individual that reproduces asexually gives rise to a clone, okay? A group of genetically identical individuals. Has anyone ever seen a starfish eat a clam? It's not terribly exciting unless you watch it in like extreme fast forward, because it's very slow. But what they do is they put their arms on both sides of the shell and they just keep pulling. Okay, what the oyster or the clam has to do is they have to clamp down the shell, which cuts off their little siphon tubes, which they use to bring in water that oxygenates their gills and brings in food. That gets pinched off. Okay, so they have to hold the shell down with no supply of oxygen or food. So the starfish, which doesn't have that problem because it's on the outside, just keeps pulling, pulling, and pulling. And eventually the clam gets tired and the shell opens up a little bit. And this is kind of the weird part. But what a starfish does is its stomach comes out of its mouth and into the clam, filling the clam with its digestive enzymes, and then it sucks it all back in. Yeah, okay. Starfish are kind of weird. Okay, but yeah, that's how they eat clams. You never look at a starfish the same way again. Okay, other examples of asexual reproduction. Okay, amoebas. Okay, this is an amoeba reproducing, splitting in half. Okay, this would be one cell and this will be the other cell. Okay, so we'll have two cells there. Mold. Mold is an asexually reproducing organism. Right? It can reproduce sexually as well, okay, but most of the time it reproduces asexually, and that's how it spreads, okay, from like one Christmas orange to another, okay, within the box. Okay, you've all had that problem, right? You look inside the box and you think, oh, this one all looks good, and then when you open it up, like there's 4 on the bottom that are rotten. Okay, or one starts to go in your fridge and the mold spreads to the others. Okay, so you got to watch it because it does reproduce asexually, which can happen a lot faster. Okay, and so it will spread. Okay, bamboo also reproduces asexually. You cut off any piece of bamboo and it'll sprout, okay, from there and grow. All right, questions on that? All right, now with sexual reproduction, you have now contributions of DNA from 2 individuals. Right? That is going to produce a lot more variation than simply cloning yourself. All right? So what happens is we have to be aware that every cell, every eukaryotic cell, contains 2 copies of each chromosome. Okay? We're what we call diploid. Okay? Which means 2N. We have 2 copies of every chromosome. Okay? In the human genome, okay, there are 23 chromosomes. In every one of your cells, there are 46. Okay? Because you have 2 copies of each one. One you got from mom and one you got from dad. Okay? Now, that can produce huge amounts of variation. Okay? Huge amounts. So much so that if we were looking at this picture right here, okay, we have 2 sets of parents and their children. Can you tell which children belong to which set of parents? Because it's not lined up. Okay? It's not that these 2 girls belong to these 2 and these 2 boys belong to these 2. Can you tell which ones belong to who? It's tough, right? Because there's so much variation possible, okay, when the gametes meet. I mean, certainly, you know, you probably look more like one of your parents than the other, okay? We all do, all right? My first son is like a mini-me, okay? My second son looks nothing like me. He's all his mom, okay? He's all his mom. That just happens sometimes, okay? But there's a lot of variation possible, okay, when there's reproduction involved. Okay, if you look not just at, let's say, facial structure, but you start looking at different parts when you have children. This is something you do when they're small. Okay, you look at like their hands. Like my son's got my face, but he's got my wife's hands, right? And things like that. It's just there's so much variation. Which thing is going to be dominant to which? Okay, is he going to get my eye color or her blood type or whatever? Okay, or is it going to be some combination of both? There's so much variation that's possible. Mother Nature is a mad scientist. Okay, because there's just so much that can go on. All right. So it's tough to tell. Even I can't tell because I don't remember. This picture was taken out of a book years ago. Okay. I don't remember which kids belong to who anymore. I think it was that one and that one. Okay. Were for those parents, and then these two were for these ones, I think. Okay, if I recall. All right, so the things to remember here, guys, is, okay, there's going to be greater variation. Two parents give rise to offspring that have unique combinations of genes inherited from both parents. All right, so half your genes came from your mother and half from your father. Now here's the thing you got to remember. Half of their DNA came from each of their parents. All right, now it's not that you're going to get an exact chromosome that your grandpa had. It's possible, okay, but during the formation of gametes, other things can happen to the chromosomes where they can get stuck together, and before the cell can reproduce, it has to pull them apart, and sometimes when it does, they break, so it has to put them back together, and it doesn't always put the right pieces back. So you could get a chromosome from your father that has pieces from your grandmother and your grandfather on it. Okay, it's called crossing over. All right, it's what happens during the formation of eggs and sperm. All right, and that is what can really start producing variation, and that happens most of the time. Okay. All right, so when your gametes are formed, remember, you have 2 copies of your DNA. So how many copies can gametes have in them? Just 1. Okay? If your gametes came over to you and they had 2 copies of all the DNA in both of them, you would have how many copies? 4. That wouldn't be good. Okay, more is not better in the case of genes, okay, and chromosomes. You don't want that. All right, most genetic types of disorders that are at least survivable, okay, are quite severe. All right, Down syndrome is a prime example. Okay, you guys all know what Down syndrome is, right? If you have Down syndrome, you have 3 copies of chromosome 21. Okay, 3 copies of it. Just because the way one gamete formed, something didn't go right, and an extra copy of that chromosome got in there. Okay. When that happens, you get all of the symptoms of Down syndrome. Most of the time when something like that happens with whatever chromosome it is, it's fatal. Okay? It usually even that, it won't even get to the point where the egg fertilizes properly. Okay? If a sperm that has that weird combination of genes in it fertilizes an egg, usually it doesn't get any further than that. Sometimes you get ones that'll, partially develop and then there'll be a miscarriage and things like that, but genetic disorders of that type are very, very severe, and usually the babies don't get carried to term, okay, because of them. They're that severe. So yeah, this is a process that most of the time works pretty well, okay, but once in a while mistakes get made. All right, so possibilities here. Here's mom and dad. Okay, they have copies of DNA from their mom and dad. Okay, so we'll say blue for boys and red for girls here. Okay, now the one possibility is that everything works exactly clockwork, and we've copied all of our DNA. Now this cell has 2 copies, and now we split again. And let's say that these are sperm here. Okay, each sperm has just the male versions of all the DNA, and down in here the eggs have all of the, sorry, these are all sperm on this side because this is dad. Okay, so we've got here, now these sperm have just copies of the maternal DNA. So these would be paternal, these would be maternal because they're from mom. Okay, or they're from his mother. In another case, you could have that the cells could have a mixture. Some from grandma, some from grandpa, some from grandma, some from grandpa, okay, etc. Okay, in the gametes that you get from mom or from dad. Okay, everyone with me there? So things like that, that can produce variation for sure. Okay, and we haven't even gotten into the crossing over part where pieces of chromosomes get stuck on top of each other, and now it's a mixture of both grandma and grandpa, or great grandma and great grandpa, or whatever. All right, so there's a 50-50 chance that a gamete produced by an offspring will have a maternal chromosome or a paternal chromosome. Okay, 50-50 chance. Okay, in the case of humans, okay, or in essentially any complex animal that reproduces sexually, okay, the combinations of maternal and paternal chromosomes resulting from gametes is 223, okay, or about 8 million. Okay, so we're saying like 8 million possible combinations of the 223 matches of chromosomes. Okay, so Each gamete that a human produces contains one of 8 million possible assortments of chromosomes inherited from that individual's mother or father. Now, here, guys, this is the crossing over part. When gametes are first being produced, okay, a cell copies all of its DNA. So instead of having 2 copies, it now has 4. All right? That cell divides down into 2 what we would say are normal cells. Okay? They have 2 copies of all the DNA. These cells divide but don't copy the DNA. So now we're down to each cell having only 1 copy. Okay? Everyone follow me there? All right? Remember, cells come from the division of existing cells. Even your gametes are produced by dividing other cells. Now, during this matching up process, you could have this crossing over occurring, okay, where a piece of a maternal chromosome ends up on the paternal chromosome and vice versa. Okay? And so now, when this gamete is produced, it's got 1 chromosome, or 1 gamete will get a perfectly normal copy of this chromosome. 1 gamete will get this copy, which is partly mom, partly dad, okay, or sorry, partly grandma, partly grandpa, right, and so on, okay? Same thing over here. That's what really can start to produce variation. Okay? That said, you still have a lot in common with your parents, agreed? Okay? Or your brothers and sisters. All right? Not everything, obviously. Okay? My sister and I have different blood types. Right? That's entirely possible too. Different eye color, all that kind of stuff. Okay, some organisms, like the Paramecium we said was an example, okay, can produce using either method, okay, and that can be advantageous. Plants can also reproduce sexually or asexually, and, oddly enough, they can even reproduce sexually with themselves. Yeah, that's weird, okay? They can fertilize themselves, okay? Their own pollen can fertilize their egg. Okay, because of the structure of the flower. Okay, so what happens is, okay, if we were, remember I drew this diagram for you, and I gave you that hourglass shape of the inside of the flower, right? And then we had the petals were down here, right? Something like that. My terrible drawing. All right, and we had these things here, the anthers that held the pollen. All right, so what happens is, as a plant grows, the anthers start lower. Right? That way the plant has a chance of catching pollen from another plant before its own pollen fertilizes itself. Okay, so when these anthers are lower, they're not going to be able to have the pollen fall on here because they're lower than it is. Okay, but pollen could blow in from another plant and fertilize this plant, in which case you've got 2 different parents. But if that doesn't happen, the plant can still reproduce by fertilizing itself. Okay, so backup plan. Backup plan, okay? No one will mate with you. You mate with yourself, I guess. I don't know. It's just what plants think. I don't know. Okay, but okay, then it can. It's still sexual reproduction because 2 gametes meet. Asexual reproduction, there's no gametes. There's just a copying. Okay, but in this is still sexual reproduction because there's 2 separate individuals or 2 separate gametes. Okay. All right. And that's it for that. Questions on that? All right. Next one here. All right, and then we'll talk about Mendel here. Mendel is pretty important. Okay? All right. So Mendel and the gene idea. Okay? Gregor Mendel. Do I not have that one in there? Oh, it should have been before that. I think I would have put it in order. Microscopy. Yeah. Mendel, yep. Okay. I might have had it in a different order, but it's in there. Okay. Gregor Mendel, okay, is generally recognized as the father of modern genetics. Okay. He did all these experiments with the pea plants in the garden that he tended in the monastery he lived in. Okay. He was a monk. Right? And he did all these studies on genetic variation. All right, so he was an Augustinian monk who used his observations of his garden peas to formulate ideas about how what he called heritable characters, okay, could be passed on from one generation to another. Okay, heritable characters were his term. It We now call those things genes. Okay, the heritable characteristics that you can get from your mom and dad. Okay, or if you're pea plants, from your mom and dad. I guess it's still the same thing. Okay, you just got, okay, how you get your DNA, what things are passed on. What Mendel really found out was that some things are dominant and some things are recessive. Right? What he found is that certain traits within the pea plant, and the things he mostly watched were flower color, the shape of the pods, and the color of the peas, okay, were kind of the big things that he watched. And he found that certain colors were far more common than others. Right? And that's what led him to this idea that some things are dominant to others. Because what he started doing was controlling who pollinated who in his garden. Right? So he would make sure that, let's say, the white plants pollinated the purple plants. Okay? And when he did that, he found that he got way more purple plants than he got white plants. So what did that tell him? Purple is dominant to white. Okay? Everyone follow me there? In fact, sometimes if he had a true breeding purple plant, that is, it always produced purple, always, 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 never produced anything else. If he bred that with a white plant, all he got was purple. Okay, which told him 100% that purple was dominant to white. The only way he could get white offspring, okay, was to either breed white with white or find an offspring from a purple and a white mating. Okay, and then he might get a few white plants out of that one. Okay, so he found that some things are dominant and some things are recessive. All right, so here's the things he looked at. Okay, peas are readily available, obviously, okay, in a wide variety of distinct shapes and colors that he could obviously see on the plant. Okay, plants can self-pollinate, so he was able to always control the genetic profile of the individuals he used. Okay, he would make sure they pollinated themselves, so he always got true breeding plants. Okay, or they can be cross-pollinated, which he would do with a paintbrush. Right, so he would go to the flowers of one plant with the paintbrush, get the pollen on the paintbrush, and then go over and apply the pollen to the flowers of the other plants. Okay, making sure that this individual pollinated that one. Okay, as kind of part of his experiments. All right, so the things he looked at: round or wrinkled peas, okay, yellow or green peas, purple or white petals on the flowers, inflated or pinched pods, yellow or green unripe pods. Okay. Axial or terminal flowers. Okay, terminal flowers are ones that only grow on the very tips of stems. Axial flowers will kind of grow anywhere. Okay, and long or short stems. He also called that tall and dwarf. Okay, versions of the plant. Okay, so these were all the characteristics that he looked at when he was kind of doing his little studies here. Okay, so we're going to look at flower color as the example. So what he took here for the parents were true breeding parents. Every time he bred this flower with itself, all he got was purple. So he knew the only genes that this plant carried was for purple. Okay, and white, well, white is always breeding white. If he kept pollinating this, he only ever got white plants. So he knew this one only carried the gene for white, this one only carried the gene for purple. When he bred them together, all he got was purple. Okay, so what he started doing was assigning a code, okay, to each of these. He said that this plant, okay, must be big P, while this one must be little p, okay? The smaller or the recessive version of the flower color gene. He always used a lowercase for the recessive version and an uppercase for these. Now, if he bred big P with little p, what's the genetic code for these plants? Big P, little p. Okay, they are what we call a heterozygote plant because they have one copy of each version of the gene. Okay, the ones he bred are homozygous because they only had one copy, okay, of that gene. Now, if he bred these plants together, what he found was he would get 3 purple flowers and 1 white flower. It was always a 3-to-1 ratio. Okay, when he bred the plants that were heterozygous, he would always get a 3-to-1 ratio. Okay, and here's why. We use what's called a Pennant Square. Right. So for this breeding here, we had big P, okay, with little p. So we get a big P, little p, big P, little p, big P, little p, big P, little p. Every single organism that's produced from that breeding is big P, little p. So they're all purple, okay? Because purple is dominant to white. But when we do the same thing for this bunch, okay, we now are breeding one big P, one little p, with one big P and one little p. So instead now we get one plant that's big P, and it will be, what color? It'll be purple. Right. We'll get one that's big P, little p, which will be purple. We'll get another one that's big P, little p, and it'll be purple. And then we'll get one plant that's little p, and it'll be white. Okay? Everyone follow me on that? That's kind of how you can do simple genetic stuff. As long as it's clearly this one is dominant to this one. Doesn't work for things like blood type. Right? Because there's more than one blood type. And some of the types are codominant. Okay? For example, if your father is type A and your mother is type B, it's possible that you could be AB, okay? Because those two are codominant. One does not override the other. However, if your father is B and your mother is O, you're going to be what? B. Because everything, A and B are both dominant to O. All right? O is actually recessive. Oddly, it's the most common blood type. Okay? It is the most common blood type. O negative is the universal donor because it has no antigens or blood coatings on it. So you can give it to anybody and their blood won't clot. Okay? If you give type B blood to a type O person, they will clot. Okay? And that will kill that person probably. Okay? So yeah, you have to make sure you know what your blood type is when you're getting blood. Now, if you're type O negative, the Red Cross loves you. They're always sending you stuff. Come and give blood. Come and give blood. Okay. Similarly, if you are something rare, okay, they always want you to come in too. Okay. Yes, you can give O negative to anybody, but it's better to give you your own brand. Okay. If you're A negative, you're best off to get A negative. You can get O negative, but it's best to get your own stuff. The shape of the proteins, the antigens on there, okay, is what gives you the type, the letter type. But you can, there's also a factor called the Rh factor, which is kind of a clotting factor, that can also be on your red blood cells. And you're either positive, you have it, or you're negative, you don't have it. Okay, so that's why you can be O negative or O positive. If you're O positive, you have no antigens, but you have the Rh factor. So you're O positive. Okay, if you have no antigens and no Rh factor, you're O negative. Okay? If you're A positive, you have the A antigen and the Rh factor. Okay? Yeah. It's possible that that can happen. It doesn't always happen, but there is a risk of that. Yes. The second baby thing has to do with a mother who has the Rh factor, but whose husband does not. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Because she has the Rh clotting factor, if her baby does not, it is possible that if there was any interaction of the blood, which there's not supposed to be, okay, but if there's any interaction of the fetal blood with the maternal blood, clotting will begin. Okay, because it's not so much that it will attack it, but a clotting action begins because one has the Rh factor and one doesn't. Okay, and if it essentially, the body sees that as there's a wound here, there's blood, and we got to stop it. Okay, and so it begins to clot, and that can cause clotting problems in the fetus. So yeah, that's not good. So they do usually check for that. When you get married, okay, it's one of the things they check is, are you going to have this Rh problem? Okay. Usually, it's not a big deal. It's just something they want to be aware of because it, in very rare occasions, can cause an issue. Yeah, but most of the time, it's not an issue. Okay? Everyone with me so far? How many people know their blood type? Yeah. A lot of people don't even know they have a blood type. Okay? Yeah, so it's not unusual that you don't. Okay? Usually, people find out the first time they give blood. Okay? Because they type you. All right? The first time you give blood, they prick your finger. And then they squeeze a drop of blood into each of these little kind of, there's 5 different plates. Okay, there's an A, a B, an O, and then sorry, 4, and then the RH plate. So any ones that clot, that applies to you. If it clots in the RH factor, you're RH positive. If it clots in the B, you're B positive. Okay, and that's how they can tell. And it's important, obviously, that they label your blood correctly, because if they're giving it to somebody else, they want to make sure they're giving them the right blood. All right. Okay, so an organism that has a pair of identical alleles. Okay, alleles are the different forms of a gene. Okay, so there are essentially 3 alleles for blood type: O, B, and A. Okay, everyone follow me on that? Yeah. Okay, for flower color, there are 2 alleles: purple or white. Right, and that's what we're looking at here, is the 2 alleles of this gene. Okay, so if you're heterozygous, you've got 1 copy of each allele, okay, and if you're homozygous, you only have 1 allele. Okay, you have 2 copies of the same allele. All right, because of dominance and recessiveness, an organism's appearance does not always reveal its genetic composition. For example, all of these plants are purple, but they do not all have the same combination of alleles. All right, it's the same thing for me, for my blood type. Okay, my blood type coding, I'm A negative. Okay, there's possibilities for my genetic code. I could be, oh, I can't see that at all. I could be AA, or I could be AO. All right, and in fact, I'm AO. Okay, I know that because my father is type A and my mother is type B. Okay, which tells me also that my father has to be type BO, because that's the only way I wouldn't have ended up as an AB, right? Is that he could give an O or a B. That's the only way I could end up as an AO. My mother could be AA or AO, same as me. Okay? Now, how would I find out what type my mother is besides asking her? Right, I look at my sibling's blood type. Okay? My sister is type O, which means my parents are both heterozygotes for their blood types. Okay, my mother's AO, just like me. Okay, my father is BO. Okay, I'm AO, and my sister's uh-oh. She was always in trouble. Okay, all right. Does that sort of make sense to everybody? Like I said, it's weird, right? There could be a lot of different combinations. If my parents had had a 3rd child, they could have been AB. Okay. They could have been B. They could have been A. They could have been anything. This is the combination that could lead to the most different blood types possible. Okay? And to top it all off, on top of that, okay, my mother is negative and my father is positive. Okay? On top of it all. All right? And I ended up negative, which means my father is heterozygous for the RH factor. He's got a positive and a negative allele of the gene. Okay, but my mother is negative negative. Okay, because that's the only way you can be negative, is to have 2 copies of the negative factor. Okay, everyone follow me there? All right, it's weird, right? There's all these things that can go into the genetic code that makes you up. Right? It's amazing that children even look like their parents, given the possibilities of all the different combinations that could be present. All right. So, different versions of genes, okay, the different alleles, so yeah, that's a term you need to know, okay, alleles are different versions of genes, account for the variations that you inherit from your parents, okay. The gene for flower color exists in 2 versions, one for purple flowers and one for white, okay. The alternative versions, okay, I like called alleles. We can relate that now to the structure of DNA essentially. Purple flower allele and the white flower allele are on the same place on the chromosome, okay, but they have a slightly different code of like A, T, C, G, all that kind of stuff, right, that you learned about before. Right? There's just different combinations of those. All right. Questions on that? Anybody know someone with two different colored eyes? Okay, also a pretty weird thing, but it happens. Okay, you get two different color eyes, right? And that's again like a partial dominance thing. That's really funky, that one. Okay, yeah, certain types of skin pigmentation can also be kind of this incomplete dominance thing over another. All right, so for each gene, an organism inherits two alleles, one from each parent. Okay, and then what you express is based on whether you got a copy of the dominant or not, or whether you're double recessive. Okay, if you're homozygous recessive, you're going to show the recessive trait. If you're heterozygous or homozygous dominant, you show the dominant trait. Okay. Okay, now, two other terms. Okay. Genotype and phenotype. Genotype is your genetic code. Okay, so like the example would be capital P, capital P. Okay, your phenotype is what you show. Purple flowers. Okay, so your blood type is your phenotype. It's what you show. Okay, your genotype is what gave you that blood type. Okay, your AO or BO or AA or whatever. All right. Okay, eye color. Is that a total dominance or partial dominance? How many different versions of eye color are there? Lots. Okay? Essentially, it comes down to brown, blue, green. Okay? But here's the thing. There's not complete dominance unless you are brown-eyed. Brown is dominant essentially to everything. Okay? Brown eyes are dominant to everything. But if you have green and blue, okay, then you can get, you know, some amount of a little bit, you know, of like a dilution, and you might be somewhere between blue and green. Okay, if you get if you get brown and green, you might end up hazel. Yeah, it's not a complete dominance thing. It's really weird. Okay, and so that's why there's so many different colors of eyes. All right, what if you have red eyes? You're albino. Yeah. Okay? If you have red eyes, you're albino. Means that your body does not produce pigments of any kind, and your eyes are red because there's no pigment in the muscles of your iris, and people can see the blood in the muscles of your iris. You thus have red eyes. Yeah. Okay? Yeah, that's why albinos have red eyes. It's because there's no pigmentation in their eyes, and you can actually see the capillaries in the muscles of the iris of the eye, and that's why they're red. Okay? They're also pasty white. Okay? If you've ever seen a picture of an albino person, they are like chalk. Okay? Just super white. And if they look at the sun, they turn red. Okay? They don't have to go out in the sun, they just have to look at it. Okay? And they'll turn red because they have no pigment, okay? And they'll get sunburned really, really easily. If you're very fair-skinned, you are like uber dark compared to an albino person. Okay? Because you can still change your skin color a little bit. All right? So yeah. And the ability for you to tan is also a genetic thing. Okay? How dark your skin is genetic. Okay? And how well you react to UV light, okay, is genetic. If you are very fair skinned, you go outside and the next day you have a red leather jumpsuit to wear. Okay? Yeah. Okay? You know what I mean? You got a really bad sunburn. Okay? If you're like me, I just walk out in the sun and turn brown. Okay? It just happens. Some of us are lucky. Okay? But is it genetic? Yes, it is. But again, Mother Nature's a mad scientist. My first son, he's like me. We go out in the sun, we turn brown. Okay? My other son, he goes out in the sun, he peels. Okay? He turns red right away and peels. All right? And I always forget to put sunscreen on him because I'm not used to putting sunscreen on. Okay? I got dark skin. I don't worry about it. I should, but I don't. Okay? And then he goes out, the two of us come back brown, and he comes back red and sore, and okay, then I feel bad. Right? But it's all genetic. Okay? It's all genetic how well your skin reacts to that. Yes. All right. If the two alleles differ, Okay, then you are heterozygous, but you will show the dominant trait as long as they are dominant and recessive. If they're co-dominant, then you're going to show some combination of both. All right, and now this is the Pennant Square that we drew there a little while ago. Okay, that shows the first breeding, or sorry, yeah, the first breeding where we had big P, and little p, little p. All of the offspring ended up, okay, as big P, little p. Now, for this one, I took one of those offspring, and I wanted to find out whether it was heterozygous or homozygous. The only way to find that out is to breed it with one I know is homozygous recessive. So I breed it with a white flowered plant, and I'll get a 50-50 ratio of white to purple in the next generation. Okay, because one plant can only give little p. This one can give big P half the time and little p half the time, which means you'll get half purple and half white, but all the purple will be heterozygous. Okay, there'll be big P, little p. Right? This is often how scientists will try and find out if something is heterozygous. They'll breed it with something they know is homozygous recessive. Okay, and it'll tell them for sure. All right, and that's kind of the reasoning that we were using when we were trying to figure out what blood type my parents had. Okay, or what blood type I was based on what my parents show. Okay, things like that. Okay, so 2 alleles for each character separate when the gametes are forming because they're on the same chromosome, and the chromosome has to separate so that each gamete gets one copy of it. All right. So looking at these 2 people here and their, let's say, genetic family tree. Okay, so this is the first generation of grandparents, and what we're looking at here is straight hairline versus widow's peak. Okay. Now you're probably all going, what am I? I don't even know. Okay? If your hair comes down to a point in the middle, okay, you got a widow's peak. All right? Now, as you get older, widow's peak increases. Okay? As hair on either side of it recedes. You don't want to do that. Okay? At your age, you probably just have a little tab. Okay? It comes down in the middle. All right? Now, looking at this, okay, we've got a grandparent up here. Boxes are males and circles are females. All right, so this is grandpa and this is grandma, and I don't know which one is. Okay, so this is paternal on this side, and this is maternal on this side. So this is mom and dad. All right, so we've got here, okay, the grandparents produced 4 children on the dad's side. Okay, grandpa was, okay, a widow's peak. Grandma was straight. Okay, now for their offspring, they got 50-50. They would have to, because one of them is a heterozygote and one of them is homozygous recessive. Okay, so yeah, 50-50. Now, I mean, if they'd had 5 kids, it wouldn't have been 50-50 because it's not an even number, but you get the idea here. Okay, they got 50-50 chance. So they have a daughter who's heterozygous widow's peak, okay, and a son who's heterozygous widow's peak, and 2 sons who are straight hairlines. All right, so the father of these 2 girls was heterozygous for widow's peak. So was mom. All right, which means their offspring should mostly show what? They should mostly show widow's peak, but there's a 1 in 4 chance that they would have straight hairline. Okay, because if we go back to the Pennant Square of this, okay, there's dad, there's mom, okay, there's a possibility of being widow's peak, homozygous, okay, there's a possibility of being widow's peak, heterozygous, widow's peak, heterozygous, or straight hairline, homozygous. Okay, they had 2 children, and one of them has a widow's peak, one of them doesn't. We won't know whether the widow's peak is heterozygous or homozygous until what? Right, until she has kids. Okay, and then we'll be able to figure out whether she's heterozygous or homozygous, because she could be either one. Okay, and there's no way for us to know until she has children. Okay, is everyone following me on that? Philip? Well, the Human Genome Project has kind of mapped all of the human genome, so all of the chromosomes, all of the gene locations. So they know where the locations for certain traits are on your genetic code. Okay. That said, they wouldn't go to a costly Southern blots test to figure out whether she's heterozygous or homozygous. Okay. That's mostly for things like paternity tests. They should be able to, yeah. Yeah, but again, it would be a lot of analysis to do so. But yeah, they would probably be able to figure that out. Okay, another one. Hanging earlobes versus attached earlobes. Okay, if you have attached earlobes, okay, your earlobes go in like this. Okay, if you have hanging earlobes, they're separate. Okay, I've got hanging earlobes, mine are separated. Okay, if yours go straight into your head, okay, then you've got attached earlobes. One is not more valuable or desirable than the other, so you don't go picking at each other. Okay? Now, same type of idea here. We've got two children. Okay? The children show different versions of the allele. Okay? This one's got an attached earlobe, which can only be present if they are homozygous recessive. The other has got hanging earlobes, which are dominant, so they could be homozygous dominant, or they could be heterozygous dominant. Okay, no way to know again until they have children of their own. Okay, but if we go back, okay, we're looking here. White boxes now indicate that they are hanging earlobes. Purple boxes are indicating now that they are attached earlobes. So on the paternal side, okay, so this is their dad's side, and here's how I can tell that. It's a box that leads to them, so this is the paternal side. Okay. So grandma and grandpa were both hanging earlobes, but they were both, okay, heterozygotes. Now, 50-50, which is what usually happens in their offspring. 4, okay, kids here, 2 with it, 2 didn't. All right. The father and the mother were both hanging earlobes, but in order for this to happen, they both had to be heterozygotes. All right. Right, that's it for that. Okay.